There is no doubt that a lot of evil things has been done by corrupted humans in the name of Christianity, using their power and the Bible out of context to justify those evil things. But there are too many pop atheist memes and slogans that dominates the culture today. Many of them I addressed on this channel, like for example the one that religions are the #1 cause of wars in the world. Take 2 minutes after to watch this video. Link is in the description box. Now, I'm not a Catholic in the sense that I'm not, for example, a Roman Catholic. Neither is my guest in today's video. But here's the thing, and most of you know this, that most of the times when a Catholic church is specifically criticized by skeptics, the same regurgitated criticism is also thrown at all Christianity, with all its churches. And I know I speak on behalf of many when I say enough of today's extremely incorrect and misrepresented Christian history. It's like the world, especially in the West, is suppressing history more and more by each day. It won't have any of the crucial role and contribution that Christians, motivated by their Christian faith, gave to the rise of modern science, universities, adoptions, and hospitals around the world. And when popular outspoken atheists like Christopher Hitchens and Stephen Fry are saying things like,
it's given the name the Enlightenment, and there is nothing, sadly, that the Catholic Church and its hierarchs likes to do more than to attack the Enlightenment. It did so at the time. Reference was made to Galileo and the fact that he was tortured for trying to explain the Copernican theory of the universe. That's history.
And get a reaction from the crowd and many internet atheists like this. Then it's really time to take another look at history again. So get your coffee, because I'm about to sit down with a very qualified and educated guest on, among other things, this topic. In Norway, he's known by many as a myth crusher. Meet Bjørn Davidsen. I've written most of his credentials in the description box below. He has also written about 10 relevant apologetic books on topics such as myths on church history, the Da Vinci Code, and many more. He has also done multiple engaging lectures in Norway, as well as written numerous articles and contributing chapters in books by other authors on the subjects I just mentioned, as well as conspiracy theories, history of technology, and more. Bjørn Davidsen, even if your initials are BAD, B-A-D, I still want to wish you very much welcome to DanielApologetics YouTube channel.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
You look so smart with all those books behind you and glasses, so I will just put my glasses on as well, and at least...
Yes, hopefully I can show my Chesterton coffee mug here, and my Leonardo t-shirt. I didn't have a Galileo t-shirt, but I think Leonardo is the second best in this program.
I should have said this when we were speaking Norwegian, but I just noticed that... well, I'm a dog person, but we adopted a street cat 3 years ago. Was found under a car, and he just woke up and started to play so much. So if I'm muting myself while you are speaking, you know the reason why. So does the audience. So yeah, and
so it's again, not because you want to stop me and just need an excuse to mute yourself.
And now we can finally start with question 1. So. Well, let's start with Galileo Galilei, Bjørn. Could you take a couple of minutes to just tell us who was he and what really happened between him and the church? And was he really tortured, like Stephen Fry said, by the church?
Galileo was definitely not tortured, and not even in danger of being tortured, as I will come back to in a moment. It's not easy to tell who Galileo was because there are so many misconceptions about him. So it's kind of easier to look at all the errors, all the wrong things people are saying. But I'll try to say something right in the beginning. He lived from 1564 to 1642, and most of his work was done in the 1600s. And he was an Italian astronomer, physicist, and engineer, and he got into trouble with the church. And as the story goes, and that is true, he had to recant his view that the Earth circled the Sun and not the Sun circling the Earth. And he did a lot of important discoveries, like within the field of observational astronomy, including discovering the phases of Venus, the 4 largest satellites of Jupiter, and that the planet Saturn even had rings. Even if he may have been the first to see all or some of this, he was not alone in making these discoveries. Other astronomers were even earlier than him. He did not invent the telescope, but he improved one version of it. And even then, some of these other astronomers made the same discoveries, sometimes just days later. And they didn't publish it in the same day, and there were some calendrical issues which made it difficult to say who really was first, but I think Galileo was first. And then there are all these myths. One of the myths is that he was the first person to show that light and heavy objects did not fall at different speed, but with the same speed from a tower. That discovery was made even more than 1,000 years earlier by the Christian philosopher John Philoponus in Alexandria, and in Oxford in the 14th century, a scholar called Bradwardine suggested it also held true in a vacuum, and it was even published before Galileo by an Italian mathematician, Benedetti, in the 1500s. So one of the myths about Galileo, it was that he was the first in almost every area, but he was definitely not. So I think if you wonder about this thing with the torture, that is one of the most well-known myths. That was related to the story that he proved that the Earth circled the Sun. And because of that, the Inquisition tortured him and cast him into prison. If one does a bit unusual thing to look at the sources, and there are a lot of sources on Galileo. We have his own discoveries and opinions written down. You have a lot of books written about him. Here is one rather heavy volume, Retrying Galileo, looking at all the notes from the court case. You have all the other books written at that time by Copernicus and Kepler and so on. And you have a lot of different also scholarly thoughts, arguments against Copernicus and Galileo's work. And of course, studies and studies and studies with his time in Rome during the court case several times. And all these kind of sources is important, because if one is to do that, I call the unusual thing, acting like a scientist or historian, and look at the data, the sources, one will see that none of these things are true. Galileo never proved that the Earth circled the Sun. It was especially Newton, but also Kepler, who made important contributions in that area. Galileo did not make sufficient progress in that area. And the trial was based more on politics than science. Galileo never spent a day in prison, and he was not tortured. And if you look at this thing with the torture, there were rather strict regulations about this. It's perhaps hard to imagine this these days, that Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, there were several Inquisitions. This is the Roman Inquisition, followed strictly rules for how to deal with people suspected for various crimes. And of course, no one likes to defend the Inquisition at all, but in some areas it is possible to find out that some of the things that are being said about them are wrong. Firstly, he cooperated with the court case, with the tribunal in 1633, when this should have happened. He was too old. There was restrictions on how old persons could be to be tortured. He was 70 years of age, and he was even sick. and he had friends in very high places. So he was defended. It was not something that the people in the Roman Inquisition dared to do, really, even if they had been allowed to do it. So when you read the word torture in the court documents, tribunal documents, it is kind of formulaic reference. It's a formula which is mentioned in all cases, because it's just to make sure that people tell the truth, threatened with torture. It's like inauguration in the United States, where the president swears on the Bible and so, and made a promise to speak the truth and so on in this court case. So all in all, he was never in danger of being tortured, and he knew it. That does not mean that he felt very comfortable or very secure in this situation, but the torture thing was not really an issue. So it's difficult to know how to really describe what happened, but one issue I think often is being insisted is that the church feared these new discoveries, and even had tried to silence Copernicus in the century before. In fact, Copernicus, who published this book the year he died in 1543, and he delayed and delayed publishing it, which made it kind of convenient for people to insist that that was because he feared the church. But in fact, the church even encouraged Copernicus. The Pope even received a lecture on his theories before his people in the Vatican Gardens 10 years before 1543. And one cardinal even wanted Copernicus to publish, and he insisted on it and wrote letters to Copernicus about, can't you publish this interesting book about this new model for the solar system? However, the issue was how to interpret the Bible in light of such a model. And as long as this model was not proven, the church and the cardinals and so on wanted Copernicus and later Galileo to set it as just a model, just a way of calculating the movements of the planets, which they hope made it easier for calendars and so on. And when it turned out, it wasn't really a lot easier, because both Copernicus and Galileo had a wrong model. They had these planets orbiting in circles, when in truth they orbited the sun in elliptical orbits, and then hence their model did not fit the data. And that made it rather difficult to accept it. And there were also a lot of others facts which made it difficult to accept this new model. So it's not a question of the Bible against science. It was a question of how to prove the model. And as one cardinal stated in 1615, that if these objections were overcome, and such a heliocentric model with the sun in the center could be demonstrated, the church would accept the science. This was in an open letter from Cardinal Bellarmine. But that didn't happen. It couldn't be shown to be true. And then the church insisted on not making a lot of new Bible interpretations, which also in those days, was related to the Reformation, where it was said that everyone could interpret the Bible, while the Catholic Church insisted that that was for the church authorities. So when Galileo suggested the ways of interpreting the Bible, which was a bit different than the church authorities, he was not met very positively, because that looked like a Protestant. This was very difficult times. In 1633, it was in the middle of the 30 Years' War, and that was one of the most terrible conflicts all over Western Europe, with hundreds of thousands, even millions of people died from starvation and so on. And even then, the church did not act against Galileo like the modern myths say. They did not put him in prison. They did not torture him. He was sentenced to a house arrest at his own property, and lived there and kept on writing scientific works.
Thank you very much for sharing that. That's, I mean, it's of course we are not like defending that all the decisions that were made then by the Catholic Church and the Church in general and everything, that this was the right way to do it. But it's important to get the facts straight. And when we have pulp atheist and this type of myth spreading around in our culture today, that he was tortured, is a big difference from torturing and house arrest in what was, as far as I understand, you can correct me, but it was quite nice property he had, and he lived there for like 9 years, and he did some of his best works also for the remaining time of his life. So it is different.
Yes. Yes, his most important scientific works were done there on the science of mechanics. His contributions in astronomy is a bit exaggerated. Kepler was a much more important figure at the time, and the one who was kind of turning point for accepting this model was Newton, 1 or 2 generations later.
Yeah. Bjørn, did the early church and Christians, did they believe and teach and promote a flat earth belief?
Again, definitely not. It was a well-known and proven fact that the earth was round. And the idea that Christians or the church in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat is a modern myth. You can't find it before the 18th or 19th century. And it's not even mentioned until especially Americans like Thomas Jefferson in the late 1700s and the author Washington Irving in his biography of Columbus in 1828. So you can't find it in any source from the medieval period, and quite the opposite, in fact. Every kind of source confirms that they knew the earth was round, from science to poetry to art. And if you look at all these sources, one of them is from the, I guess, most renowned theologian and philosopher of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas. And he wrote in his great theological work, Summa Theologica, around 1270, in the first article. This was the way he opened the book to make it absolutely clear for his student that they understood him. And he wrote that the astronomer and the physicist both may prove the same conclusion. His point was to show that different sciences may arrive at the same conclusion. And his example is that the earth, for instance, is round. So to be absolutely sure that his students understood him, he used one example which he knew they were familiar with. That was that the earth was round, a globe. And you can find the same thing in all the other great works in the medieval period. If you look at Dante's Divine Comedy, the great Italian author who wrote this in the early 1300s. And this is about Dante and various companions, a bit like your cat behind you there, who went on a journey from Jerusalem and to the middle of the round earth, through the circles of Inferno, and then on the opposite side of the round earth, and then out in space to the circular spheres where the planets were. and they could look down on the round earth. And you find this even in art. If you look at the statues and figures of e.g. Charlemagne, the German, Roman, Frankian emperor, he has this imperial orb in his left hand, the Reichsapfel, Rikseple in Norwegian. And this was a round globe, which he had in his hand and a cross on the top, indicating that Christ is Lord of all. And this is a kind of typical crown jewels all over Europe. And we do even have a terrestrial globe in Europe, the oldest one from 1490, which was before Columbus discovered America. And in Norway, we have also our own national saint, Saint Olav. And if you look at the figures of Olaf, even he had this globe in his left hand and with the cross on the top. So the more Christian, the more Catholic you were, the more into Saint Olaf you were, the more you celebrated him or prayed to him, the more you knew that the earth in fact was round. So it was not like the Christians insisted the earth was not round. The more Christian you were, the more you knew that the earth was a globe. So this myth is very strange that it arose at all, and it's even stranger that it has been kept in so many years. And now this is soon to be 200 years since Washington Irving, and I find it still in some school textbooks, and it's really not a credit to the authors of these textbooks and other popular magazines to maintain that one in the medieval period thought the earth was flat. The flat earth movement is a funny story because it arose after Washington Irving and the people who picked up his book and made an even greater number of it than Irving. And they imagined that this was the old Christian belief. And some of those at least did that. And then they thought kind of misunderstood loyalty to go back to what they thought was the medieval view, which it definitely was not. So the flat earth movement, it arose in the mid-1800s. So it's an effect of this misunderstanding of what they believed in the Middle Ages.
Yeah. As you probably know, the ancient motto of Oxford University is Dominus Illuminator Mea, the Lord is my light. And when you go to the Harvard University, it has been changed now, this motto, but it is Christus, it's Veritas Christus Ecclesia, for the Christ and the Church, for the glory of, true for Christ and the Church. The important role that Christianity has played in shaping our society and the world as we know it today, not only the education part, but also in terms of hospitals, modern science, adoption, the whole thing. Could you talk a few minutes about that?
Yes, it's, as you understand, difficult to talk just for a few minutes, but I'll try to make it very short. If you look at the church history and the adoption of science, development of science, you note that if you look at the books that I read in the Middle Ages and in the late antiquity period, many of them were about the area of the 7 liberal arts. And among them were mathematics and astronomy and rhetoric, grammar and so on. And this is one late Roman author who wrote about this in the, I think, 400s. And you have then the Christian authors like Cassiodorus, who made a kind of list of which books should be among those to be studied. So it was about also the secular learning. And this is a very interesting list of books by important Hellenistic authors, writers. And they even picked up a lot of dictionaries, like this one by Isidore Seville from this city in Spain in the 600. And you have a lot of material. You have a lot of books on logic. This is a 12th century book by John Salisbury on logic, and I can just mention all these books. And my point is not to kind of overwhelm you, hopefully, with books, but to show that this was a living tradition. Of course, it went in kind of waves, and much of this was about the economy and the threat of war and so on. So it was not always very easy to maintain learning, and even we Norwegians play a part of this. The Viking attacks did set part of this back some generations. However, you have a lot of learning in this period. And around Charlemagne in the late 1700s, you had this great scholar Alcuin. You had the emergence of universities later around the year 1100s. And all such stuff made this area of education, the cathedral schools and later universities, very important part of medieval life. When it comes to hospitals, this was in fact even mandatory. At the Council of Nicaea in 325, it was one of the things they decided on was that every cathedral should have an adjacent hospital. A hospital was a place where the ill, the elderly, the sick people could go and be treated and live without having to pay. Of course, yeah, they did have places for the rich to go long before this, and I guess that had always been part of history. But the new thing that Christians here started was a major movement for hospitals for the poor. And that made a major impact on the view of humans and of how we have treated people since. And this tradition, of course, went on from the Council of Nicaea through the medieval period and into the modern times. When it comes to adoption or child welfare, there are a lot of interesting stuff on this. One of my favorite books is a book about the orphans of Byzantium, child welfare in the Christian Empire, which goes back to Nicaea and later, and look at various ways Christians and the church and the state in combination have put up places and institutions for child welfare. So they combined ancient Roman legal institutions with Christian concepts of charity, and this ended with a child welfare system that tried to select foster parents for homeless children or place them in group homes that could provide food, shelter, and education. And of course, one could look at some dark sides of this. People even in 1,000 or 1,500 years ago, but the system they started was mainly for the good. And the alternative, not to take care of the orphans, was a lot worse than even some of the worst things that happened in the centuries after, and we even read about from the 20th century. And to end up with science in general, which is even a large subject, I think it's important to realize that how we think about natural science is influenced by how we think about nature and reality. Science is hard to get started or promoted in cultures that believes in gods or the whim of the gods or the unpredictability of nature. And in Norway, the Vikings did definitely not develop anything that looked like modern science or science at all. But the Greek philosophers did when they started to slip away from the polytheistic view of the many gods and into their philosophy based on an underlying divine ground, which made natural law possible. And this was taken up by the church, later by even the Islamic, Arabic cultures, and ended up with a large tradition of natural science during the Middle Ages. So all we hear about this conflict thesis, which were old-fashioned in the late 19th century and still is in some circles, it is based on a misunderstanding of this history. And those who study this history these days are definitely not supporting anything that looks like this conflict thesis, even if at some times in history there's been some tension between theology and science. But basically, science needs to be being built on something which is solid enough. So I think you need to grasp how strange and different scientific thought really is. Nature is complicated. It behaves in strange ways. Accidents happens. It's not easy to decipher what's really going on around. I mean, who can predict the weather? Even today, the experts go wrong. And there is a strong tendency to think magically, putting the gods or ourselves or fate in the center, instead to put reason and natural laws in the center. That is uncommon sense. And I think the most significant contribution of natural philosophers in the Middle Ages was to make modern science even conceivable. So their focus on, one might even say, intoxication by reason, set a path toward future discoveries and other ways of doing science, because they definitely did not do science like we do. They did not even think about it very much like we do, but their insistence on reason and various causes and so on showed that science could be useful, and they constructed a worldview where it made sense to do science. So the central belief that nature was created by God made it possible to believe we were able to understand something of what went on in nature, and it was worth to explore and discover what was God's acts and thoughts with nature. So to say that reason or science is the opposite of Christian faith is to miss the whole point. Modern science is a grandchildren, or perhaps even a child of the medieval period, and it's I find it hard to understand how science could have developed the way it did without this theological background it had.
It's good that we have people that knows their history like you, and that was kind of the last question I had for us today. I know that videos that goes well over 1 hour has less chance of being seen, so I think we'll just round it up there. But I would just like to say thank you very much for coming. God bless you and the work you are doing. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much for being invited.
Just one more quick thing before you go. Of course, on top of subscribe, comment, like, share, hashtag, consider to support this ministry on Patreon or Subscribestar, if, and a big if, able and interested. I'm doing apologetics and evangelism one-on-one on the street here in Slovakia and Norway, on top of making videos every week defending Christian truth. And your support allows me to take more and more time to do ministry work. So if, and a big if, able and interested, prayerfully consider to do that. Links are below in the description box. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.